1988, I was killed by my fiancée and good friends. When I was in high school, Grace persuaded me to drop out of school to earn money to support her college education. She said, when she graduates, she will definitely marry me. So I worked hard day and night, setting up a stall on the street during the day and working the night shift in the garage at night. My hands were covered with calluses and my body was overdrawn to the point of being unable to bear the burden. But on the day of her graduation, I was greeted with a cold verdict. The engagement is canceled. I'm going to marry Anthony. In fact, this senior had already given birth to their child behind my back. They emptied my savings and took away everything I had with a smile. When I questioned Grace, she didn't feel the slightest bit of guilt and even mocked me for being naive. In the end, they even teamed up to kill me and buried me in a shallow grave. I struggled and shouted, but my life had already been buried. They used my hard-earned money to live in luxury houses, drive luxury cars, and lead the high-class life they always dreamed of. As for me, in their eyes, it seems that I never existed. But just when I thought it was all over, I opened my eyes again and found myself back on that day, the crucial moment before I dropped out of school. At this time, Grace was still begging me to give up my dream to earn money for her schooling. Her family was too poor to support her schooling because she had a father who could not take care of himself and a younger brother. She said that if I were a boy, I could find a job even without graduating from college. But since she was a girl, she had to go to college to realize her dream of becoming a senior white-collar worker in the financial industry, and she promised to marry me after graduation. So she asked me to give up the tutoring exam and go out to work part-time to earn money so that she could concentrate on her studies. This time, I gave her 2 loud slaps without hesitation. Grace, from today on, the engagement between you and me is completely over. I gritted my teeth and said it word by word. Then, I turned and walked away without looking at her again. I swear, in this life, I will live for myself. Michael, you don't need to take any college exams. Grace insisted. You should go to work and help me pay for my tuition. If we both go to college, what will we do with our tuition? You know our family can't afford my tuition. Don't you say you love me? Anthony also spoke coldly. Yes, Michael, you are too ignorant. You should help Grace realize her dream. This is the real way to love her. You give all the money to Grace and let her succeed. When she graduates and makes money, won't you enjoy the good life with her? I blinked coldly and looked at the 2 people in front of me. Grace, my former fiancé. Anthony, my so-called good friend in my previous life, was also Grace's senior in college. He was also the man who completely ruined my life. Now, a cold smile appeared on the corner of my mouth. I was the best student in my class, with enough ability to get into a top university and start a bright future. But I gave it all up. For Grace. During the day, I set up a stall on the streets of Los Angeles, exposed to the wind and sun. At night, I took on all kinds of physical work until my hands were rubbed and bled by the rough tools. I even took care of her father and brother, cooking, cleaning, and doing laundry. Grace's family was lazy and heartless, and treated me like a free male servant, but I put up with it, because I thought it was love. I treated his family as my own. After all these years of suffering and hard work, Grace finally graduated from college and got the white-collar job she had always dreamed of. I naively thought that it was all worth it. He would fulfill his promise, marry me, and spend the rest of his life with me. But I was wrong. She did when she got home was to announce in front of everyone that we were breaking off our engagement. She said she was going to marry Anthony. At that moment, I felt cold all over, as if I had fallen into an abyss. Grace and Anthony had been together long before college. They planned everything, from applying to the same university to living together, to sharing my hard-earned money. And I was the stupid sponsor who funded their love and future. I worked very hard every day, day and night to make money, and the money I earned not only supported Grace, but also Anthony. They squandered the fruits of my labor and enjoyed my sacrifice. Both of their families, who were too poor to afford tuition and living expenses, lived a rich life thanks to me. They were planning to move their family away from the lowly countryside they considered to be and move to the city to start a new life. But I had nothing. No one cared about my years of sacrifice, and my love was trampled upon and became worthless. I even took care of Grace's father and brother, treating them as my own family, but they only treated me as a servant who could be used at will. In their eyes, I was never worthy of happiness. When I knelt in front of Grace and asked her crying, "Why? Why did you betray me?" She looked at me with a sneer, saying that I was going too far, and even accused me of damaging her reputation. Finally, she and Anthony teamed up to orchestrate my death, taking away everything I had left and burying me in a shallow, nameless grave, like an old object that had no further use. And they, taking my money and stepping on my sacrifices, prosper in the city and live a life of luxury. And I will disappear from this world forever, without a name and without dignity. But this time, everything is different. When I woke up again, I found myself going back to the past, back to the day when all the mistakes had not yet started. Heaven has given me this opportunity, and I swear, I will destroy Grace and Anthony's future with my own hands. I was reborn and returned to the most pivotal day of my life. This was the day Grace advised me to give up the college entrance examination. I raised my head and looked at Grace in front of me. In my previous life, I was obsessed with her without any reason and naively believed everything she said. Even though we were only engaged at the time, I was willing to sacrifice everything for her, and even regarded her as the center of my life and the only light. But now, when I look at this woman again, I feel only deep disgust in my heart. Grace was getting impatient when she saw my silence. Can you give me a straight answer? Her tone was oppressive, as if it was a matter of course. She paused, leaned in close to me, hugged me, smiled confidently, and continued, "Don't worry, Michael. Once I graduate from college, I will definitely marry you. I, Grace, always keep my word." Hearing this, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Your words. I sneered at her. Grace, if your words were believed, then even sows could climb trees. What are you laughing at? Grace raised her voice impatiently. Michael, I'm talking to you. She stared at me with anger in her eyes and raised her hand slowly, rolling up her sleeves as if threatening. Oh, yes, this is her. Not only was she a despicable liar, she was also a violent person. In my previous life, whenever I didn't do something according to her wishes, she would teach me a lesson with her fists. Then, after the violence, she would kneel on the floor, begging for forgiveness with tears on her face. She would slap herself, saying she couldn't control herself, and swear she would never hurt me again. And I forgave her again and again, afraid of losing her. But in this life, I have seen through this woman. Her hypocrisy, her viciousness, her shamelessness. I don't love her anymore. More importantly, I'm not afraid of her anymore. Grace could swing her hand over. I stepped forward, raised my hand, and slapped her twice with all my strength. Pa, pa. The crisp sound of slapping echoed in the air, as if time had stopped for a moment. The air around them suddenly became suffocatingly quiet. Anthony screamed in fear, covered his mouth with his hands, and his eyes widened with disbelief. When he came to his senses, he immediately rushed to Grace, checked her face, and almost cried. Grace, are you okay? His voice was trembling, like a poor performance. My actions and Anthony's screams attracted the attention of the villagers passing by. Soon, a small group of people gathered around, whispering and watching the scene. Grace covered her face, and two bright red palm prints were clearly visible on her cheeks. The corners of her mouth twitched slightly, and anger and shock were intertwined in her expression. She stared at me fiercely, as if she couldn't accept the fact that was happening in front of her. Michael, are you crazy? She said in a low voice, trembling a little. How dare you hit Grace? Anthony's fingers trembled as he pointed at me. His voice became sharp and piercing because of anger and panic. Michael, are you crazy? Think about what you are doing. Grace is your fiancée. How could you hit him like this? I sneered and glanced at him calmly. Fiancé? Do you still remember this? Him coldly. Looking at the way you protected her just now, I thought she was your fiancée. Anthony's face turned pale instantly. More and more villagers gathered around him and formed a circle. Anthony's eyes wandered around, and when he saw more and more eyes focused on him, he suddenly lowered his head and began to sob. Michael, she sobbed, trying to gain sympathy with her trembling voice. I endured your bullying for so many years, just because Grace always told me to endure it, saying that you were a poor boy who needed protection. I have always tried to understand you, but now you are like this. You hit Grace. How could you do this? I just gave you some advice out of kindness, but you treated me and Grace like this? You slandered me and ruined my reputation. I never thought you could be so vicious. His crying was plaintive and loud, as if he wanted everyone to hear it. Grace quickly recovered from her shock. She lowered her head, covered her still red cheeks with her hands, and said in a sad voice, Michael, I really misjudged you. She raised her head and looked at me with a hypocritical expression. I always thought you were a kind man, and I always thought we would have a future. I planned everything for us and studied hard so that I could make a lot of money in the future and marry you gloriously so that we can all live a good life. But now I see what kind of person you are. How could you do this to me? She spoke louder and louder, as if to make sure that everyone watching could hear her clearly. The villagers nearby began to talk, and their voices gradually drowned out his words. What's going on? Isn't that boy the girl that Lao Zhong loves? Yeah. Why did he hit someone? And he even hit his fiancée? I heard that Grace worked so hard to get into college, but this boy is so unreasonable. Poor Grace. And Anthony, what a good boy, who put up with Michael's temper for so many years. I don't know how Michael became like this after old Joan died. Without a woman to control him, he was completely out of control. This is too much. Anthony is such a kind person, yet he is bullied by Michael like this. The discussions around me grew louder and louder, and the harsh comments were like knives trying to cut me open. Anthony heard these words. His tears started to flow even more, as if his acting skills had reached their peak. He covered his mouth with his hands, and his shoulders kept shaking, as if all this was an incomparable humiliation to him. Seeing all this, I couldn't help but laugh. Yes, laugh. Their performance was so ridiculous, so well coordinated, as if they were performing a well-rehearsed play. Every word, every movement, even his crying, seemed to be calculated with precision. What a wonderful performance, I said coldly, with a tone full of sarcasm. My voice was not loud, but clear enough to make the surroundings quiet for a moment. Anthony looked up when he heard what I said, looking at me with a wronged expression. His face was full of tear marks, but the panic in his eyes could not deceive me. Michael, how can you say that? Anthony cried, as if he had suffered a great injustice. I smiled and shook my head, and said softly, keep going, don't stop. Your play is much more exciting than the previous stage plays in the village. The chatter around us is getting louder and louder, and if they like pretending to be victims, then I'll let them really get a taste of it. These two despicable people are birds of a feather. They are good at standing on the moral high ground and manipulating people's public opinion and sympathy. In my last life, they used this trick to destroy me. In this life, I will use the same method to make them suffer the consequences. I took a deep breath, rolled up my sleeves, and my eyes filled with tears, as if the grievances that had been suppressed for a long time finally burst out at this moment. I looked at Grace with tears in my eyes. Grace, how could you do this to me? How could you be so ungrateful? I stared at her, my eyes full of pain and accusation. I continued, I gave you all my money. I took care of your father and brother for you, because I loved you and I believed in you. But even though you often beat me, I never told anyone and always endured it silently. The crowd was suddenly in an uproar, and the whispers around gradually increased. But today, I choked, raised my hand, and wiped away my tears with my sleeve. I really couldn't help it. I just fought back reflexively. But what about you? You actually gathered everyone to accuse me and humiliate me. I rolled up my sleeves, exposing my arms, and said with tears in my eyes, look, these bruises, these scratches, they were all caused a few days ago. I have been holding it in without telling anyone. My voice became increasingly sad, and my tone was full of accusations. I don't have the strength to endure it anymore. Tell me, have I done anything wrong? The clearly visible bruises and scratches on my arms now became the most powerful evidence. Those scars were left by doing rough work before. Some of them had scabs, and some were still slightly blue, but they all met my purpose just right. The crowd suddenly fell silent, so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Suddenly, someone whispered, Grace actually hits a man? Oh my God, a man is beaten like this by his own woman. How much does he love his woman to not fight back? Another voice shouted angrily. What a scumbag a woman like this is. The villagers nearby echoed indignantly. How disgusting. I actually thought she was a rare good girl. Anthony and Grace's faces turned pale at the same time. They obviously didn't expect things to develop in this direction. I struck while the iron was hot, wiped the tears from my face with my sleeve, and continued to look at Grace, my tone full of sorrow. Grace, am I not good to you? Or are you just tired of me and want to get rid of me? I paused, sighed deeply, and said with a hint of self-mockery, oh, I see. It must be because Anthony is so outstanding. He is so handsome and so smart. It is only natural that he likes you, and you fall in love with him. Anthony's face immediately turned red when he heard what I said. He looked at Grace shyly, pinched the corner of his clothes nervously with both hands, and stammered in a low voice. No, it's not like that. Grace, don't misunderstand me. His expression made it even more revealing, and although his acting was poor, it played exactly what I wanted. Grace's face turned from white to blue, and finally to a strange green. His finger trembled as he pointed at me, his voice breaking with anger. You vicious man. Stop making random accusations. I just took a step back slowly, covering my mouth with my hands, as if I was hurt by her words. Then, I staggered 2 steps in despair and collapsed to the ground. That's enough, Grace. I sobbed softly, tears falling like beads from a broken string. Since you're tired of me, let's end it. Let's cancel the engagement. From now on, you go your way, I go mine, and we are strangers. My voice became lower and lower, and finally was almost swallowed by tears. At this moment, the villagers around me were completely silent, with only my suppressed sobs echoing in the air. Everyone was shocked by the play. My performance was so real that even I was satisfied. The villagers were critical of me at first, but they were clearly impressed by my performance. Soon, someone muttered, "So, this is the truth of the matter. I really misunderstood her." Another person echoed, "Grace was right to call off the engagement, but looking at the situation, maybe he's dumping her." "Yeah, they're just engaged and not married yet. It's not too late to quit now." Someone else added, "He's still young." An elderly villager shook his head and said comfortingly, "He'll definitely find someone better than Grace in the future." Grace with contempt. Some people even rolled up their sleeves and pointed at her, as if they were blaming a liar who had completely exposed his true face. Grace stood there, his expression stiff and dull. He obviously didn't expect the situation to change so quickly and completely out of control. He tried to say something, but as soon as he opened his mouth, the villagers' boos and scolding came at him like a tide. "You actually hit a man," a young man said angrily. "What a hateful woman." "A woman hits her own man? Who does she think she is?" another villager said indignantly. "I feel sorry for Anthony," one woman said coldly, "for being in such a league with people like him." Grace's forehead began to sweat. She wiped her face with her hand and tried to defend herself, but no one was willing to listen to her. He could only stand there blankly, gritting his teeth, staring at me with resentment. "Michael, are you serious?" she finally hissed, her tone full of anger and threat. "If you really want to cancel the engagement, then fine, I will do it. But don't come to me crying. Wait until you regret it." I stood up calmly and answered her in a firm tone. "I never took it that seriously, Grace. I will never regret this decision." Her coldly, "You only get one chance in life, and I will never make the same mistake again." Hearing this, Grace's face twisted with anger. She spat viciously, her tone full of contempt. "Then let's cancel the engagement. But remember my words, when I succeed and make a fortune, don't come back and beg me to marry you on your knees." I shook my head slightly and looked at him with a mocking smile. "Grace, you will never have such a chance in your life. I promise." This woman, who was my everything in my last life, is now nothing more than a joke. She doesn't understand that without me, she can't even go to college. Her self-confidence is so ridiculous that it's not even worth taking seriously. She obviously still thought I was just throwing a tantrum. She dreamed of getting rich, becoming successful, and acting like a clown. But I knew she couldn't do that without me, unless she wanted to abandon her father and her young brother who couldn't take care of themselves. "Don't worry, Grace," I added coolly. "I won't regret it, just as you don't have to worry. I'll never ask you to come back again." "Huh?" Grace sneered and spat on the ground again. "Beg me? Are you worthy? You are just an uneducated man. I would rather die by banging my head against the wall than look at you again." Her words sparked the anger of the crowd. Several older women immediately stood up and pointed at her, cursing, "What's wrong with an uneducated man? Now this man has raised an ungrateful person like you, and you still have the nerve to speak. Ungrateful woman. Get out of our village now and stop embarrassing us women." More and more villagers gathered. Their voices became more severe, with accusatory anger. Grace finally couldn't bear it anymore. Her face flushed. She turned around and wanted to leave, even grabbing Anthony's arm and dragging her away. But I had no intention of letting her go so easily. "Wait a moment." My voice was clear and firm, echoing among the crowd. Grace stopped walking, turned her head and said with an arrogant smile, "What? You finally know you were wrong? It's too late, Michael. If you kneel down and beg me now, maybe I can forgive you. But you have to compensate me first, dash." She deliberately raised her voice. "Give me $1,000, buy some new clothes for my brother, and then we can forget all this." Her words almost made me laugh. I raised my hand and shook my head gently, my voice clearer than hers. "Since we have broken off the engagement, you have to pay back the money I lent you. Grace, we have to settle this account." Grace's face flushed immediately, and anger burned in her eyes. What nonsense are you talking about? When did I ever borrow money from you? I raised my eyebrows and said calmly, okay, then I'll help you recall it one by one. For example, $100, and you said you wanted to treat your classmates to a meal on your birthday? In July 1985, I continued without hesitation. You said you needed $200 to buy clothes for your father because his clothes were torn? In March 1984, you said you needed $1,000 to buy a beautiful bag for Christmas. Before I could finish my words, Grace suddenly interrupted me. Her face flushed, and she shouted rudely, "You crazy lying man! Stop talking nonsense. If you have evidence, show it. If you don't have evidence, don't even think about saying that I owe you anything." Her reaction was so intense that she was a little out of control, but the more she reacted, the more suspicious the crowd became of her. So, Grace has been eating and drinking for free? She's eating from the pot while looking outside. Someone in the crowd whispered, "You didn't even leave a receipt when you owed me money. How shameless." Another person frowned and said, "And you have the nerve to curse me back. Michael works so hard to support her and her family, and she treats him like this? What a shame." Those who were originally defending Grace now quietly retreated behind the crowd, pretending that they had said nothing. The villagers' discussions were like a wave, completely drowning Grace. His face was full of tension, and his eyes were darting around, as if he was desperately looking for a way to escape. She turned her face suddenly, glared at me, and growled through gritted teeth, "Do you really want me to retaliate against you?" I nodded without hesitation, my tone calm but firm. "Of course. You must pay back the money you owe me. $200. In those days, this was not a small amount of money. This was the money I saved through countless days and nights of hard work and frugality. I would never let her walk away with this money. The villagers around me all spoke up to support me. Yes, Michael should get his money back. Grace, if you are still a human being, pay Michael back the money you owe him," an elderly villager said sternly, his tone full of condemnation. "At least keep some dignity," someone else in the crowd echoed. Grace's face flushed red, and a layer of cold sweat appeared on her forehead. She gritted her teeth, as if she was completely cornered, and finally squeezed out a sentence reluctantly. "Okay, I will pay you back. Wait." However, before she could catch her breath, Anthony interrupted. With his usual sarcastic tone, he said, "Michael, are you really going to get into such a fight with Grace over a few $100s? You've known each other for so long. Is it really worth it for you to be so fussy?" Anthony's words made me pause. I looked up and looked at him deeply, my eyes filled with tears, but my tone was even sadder. "Yes, I am so humble, Anthony. I am nothing. I can't compare to your generosity." I took a deep breath, with a hint of bitterness in my voice. "After all, you are so generous, spending my hard-earned money every day and pestering Grace. Since you love her so much, why don't you pay off her debt to me?" My words were like a bomb that exploded in this conservative little village. People here value morality and loyalty the most, and infidelity in a marriage is undoubtedly the greatest shame. Hearing what I said, the villagers were all stunned, and then whispers gradually sounded. Anthony's face immediately turned pale, and then red. His eyes were filled with tears, and he said in a trembling voice, "Michael, how can you say that? Grace and I are just friends. How dare you accuse us like this?" Grace was also anxious. She pointed at me and her voice was full of anger. "Michael, don't go too far. Apologize to Anthony immediately. Otherwise, I swear, I will never marry a poor guy like you." I almost rolled my eyes at her threat. It was so ridiculous that I wanted to laugh. She actually thought that I had to marry her? I looked at her with disdain. "Grace, even if you are the only woman left in the world, I will not marry you. Don't worry." Hearing this, Grace rolled up her sleeves, obviously wanting to attack again. But this time, several strong women in the crowd stood up and blocked my way. "What do you want to do?" a tall woman questioned with anger in her tone. "Who do you think you are? Are you showing off here? Are you and your lover bullying Michael?" Other women in the village are embarrassed to hit other women, but we are women and we are not afraid. Another man added, "You and Anthony are a disgrace to the village. We have been tolerant enough, but don't go too far. If you dare to touch Michael again, you will be messing with all of us." A tense atmosphere filled the air, and several hot-tempered villagers had even rolled up their sleeves, ready to drag Grace out and give her a beating at any time. Meanwhile, Anthony was surrounded by several older women. They scolded her with contempt in their voices. "Anthony, how dare you do such a thing? Are you still worthy of living in this village? Anthony, face turned red, tears kept falling, and she covered her face with her hands, trying to hide her embarrassment. At that moment, Grace and Anthony finally became the laughing stock of the village. They were in a state of embarrassment, running away in the crowd like rats, stumbling away. As the crowd dispersed, I quietly stepped away from their sight. After nodding to the villagers who supported me, I turned and left, feeling a sense of relief and relief. In this life, I will no longer waste my time and energy on people who are not worthy. I had come here to help Grace's Aunt Linda with her family's market stall, but after the chaos I had just experienced, I had made up my mind to get out of this business once and for all. This stall is not mine. Why should I waste my time helping them? Memories of my previous life came to my mind. Before I dropped out of school, I helped Linda run the stall almost every day. After I dropped out of school, I even set up my own stall, selling handmade products and working hard to make money. What about the money I earned? Most of it was spent on Grace and his family. Linda saw my efforts firsthand, but she never really recognized me. When Grace graduated from college and came home, she was the first to stand up and support her to break up our engagement. She even mocked me, saying that I was not worthy of Grace and that I was a toad wanting to eat swan meat. Her cold and mean face is deeply engraved in my memory. This time, I will not waste even a little energy on such an ungrateful person. When I got home, I opened the door and saw Linda lying on the bed leisurely. The electric fan was humming, and she was eating watermelon and staring at the TV screen, looking very comfortable. She looked up and saw me, her brows immediately furrowed. Why did you come back during the day? Where's the stall? Don't tell me you left the stall and asked Grace to take care of it. From her expression, I could tell that she was not worried about the stall, but about Grace. Sure enough, Linda immediately started nagging. Grace shouldn't do those things. She wants to do big things. How can Grace be allowed to take care of such a trivial matter as the stall? That's the job of those worthless women in the village. She clicked her tongue and put on a disdainful expression. Why are you so lazy? Go back and take care of the stall. By the way, let Grace go home. I have something to tell her. After saying that, she sat up from the bed, walked over and gently pushed me, motioning for me to leave quickly. Just then, a lazy voice came from the next room. Aunt, wait. Linda stopped and I looked up. Grace's brother, Tyler. Yawning, he walked out of the room slowly. He rubbed his eyes, glanced at me, and said listlessly, I'm hungry. Ask him to get me something to eat before he leaves. Linda glanced at Taylor, snorted coldly, and waved her hand. What decent thing can he make? If you don't have money, go out and buy something. Don't count on him. After saying that, Linda glanced at me, as if she felt that my existence was meaningless. Taylor had no sense of courtesy at all. He yelled at me, Hey, give me some money. His matter-of-fact attitude, coupled with Linda's indifference, made me want to laugh. This family is really a bunch of parasites. In my last life, I foolishly treated them as my family, and their indifference and exploitation as my responsibility. But in this life, I realized that this group of people is not worth any of my efforts. I ignored Taylor's shouting, but raised the corners of my mouth slightly, with a hint of irony. It's time to let them know that I am no longer this silly boy who lets them do whatever they want. In my past life, Linda and Tyler took full advantage of my love for Grace and treated me as their personal servant and ATM. I turned to Linda coldly and said, If you are worried that your things will be lost if the stall is unattended, then you can deal with it yourself. It's your stuff, not mine. Then, I looked at Taylor. His self-righteous look made me feel sick. As for food, I don't have any, and I don't have any money to give you. But if you don't pay back the money I lent you a few days ago, I will let the whole village know that you stole your classmate's stationery. My words made them both freeze for a moment, and the expressions on their faces changed from surprise to anger, and then to panic. What do you mean? Taylor stuttered. I sneered. My tone was cold. Haven't I made it clear enough? You two are not my family, and I don't owe you anything. From now on, you are no longer welcome. Get out of my house. My words stunned them. Linda's lips trembled, as if she couldn't believe I would say such a thing. She pointed at me, shaking with anger. You ungrateful guy. How dare you say that to me? Have you forgotten that I am your elder? I looked at her calmly, my voice still cold. Yes, this house is mine. A few years ago, after my parents passed away, this spacious and bright courtyard house belonged to me. And your family moved in because you took the initiative to ask for it, saying it was to take care of me and strengthen our relationship. But what is the reality? Your family lives a comfortable life, occupying the main house, while I was driven to the side room, like an outsider. Linda was choked by my words and couldn't say a word. She turned to curse loudly. Okay, just wait. You will never be able to marry a woman as good as Grace. Taylor was not to be outdone and sneered, You crazy man. Apologize to my aunt immediately. Otherwise, you will have a hard time. And don't forget, my sister will come back to deal with you. They obviously naively thought that I would be scared by Grace's name. I smiled faintly and said with a disdainful tone, Oh, it seems that you don't know yet? Grace and I have broken off our engagement. These words made them both freeze, and the expressions on their faces changed from anger to disbelief. Are you crazy? You broke off your engagement with Grace? Linda exclaimed, her voice full of panic. Aren't you afraid that no one will want you? She grabbed my sleeves, tears welled up in her eyes, and she pleaded, No, Michael, you can't break up the engagement. If you do, who will manage the stall? What will you do to Grace and our family? What should we do? I couldn't help but sneer. The stall matter is your family's business. From now on, it has nothing to do with me. At this time, Taylor rushed over, grabbed my trouser legs tightly, and said desperately, No, you can't cancel the engagement. You must be my brother-in-law. I almost wanted to laugh out loud when I heard this. This was actually said by the person who just called me a dead man. The double standards and shamelessness of their family simply made me feel sick. If you don't leave, I said coldly, I'll call the villagers over and let them judge the situation. Let's see what they will say. Grace and I have broken off our engagement, and you're still staying in my house. Isn't that a bit too much? I'll call the police. Linda obviously knew which side the villagers would stand on. Her face changed completely, and she hurriedly pulled Taylor up. Okay, let's go. This should be fine. She grumbled as she gathered her things, muttering, I don't know what's wrong with you, but just wait. I didn't bother to pay attention to her complaints. I just stood at the door and urged coldly, Hurry up. Taylor leaned against the wall, took out a worn-out piggy bank with a look of resignation, and angrily threw it at my feet. This is all the money I have. Take it. I picked up the piggy bank that Taylor threw to me and shook it casually, listening to the sound of coins and a few crumpled banknotes inside, and a faint smile appeared on the corner of my mouth. That's enough, I said coldly, looking up at them. I'll let Grace make up the rest. Don't worry, don't let the door hit you. Linda and Taylor's faces immediately turned livid, and they stared at me angrily, but there was no room for rebuttal. Finally, they rushed out angrily, cursing, and disappeared from my sight in a mess. After they left, I returned to the house, and for the first time, I felt a peace I had never felt before. This house finally belonged to me, the real me. I began to clean out every corner of the house, throwing away everything that Linda and Tyler had used. Linda might have thought that she could use the junk they left behind one day, but in my new life, nothing superfluous or unlucky could be left behind. I even changed all the locks. From today on, this will be the starting point of my new life. After packing everything, I borrowed a bicycle from the village chief and rode to the city. The college entrance examination is coming, and I know that entering a good university is the key to changing my destiny. In this life, I will not waste the second chance given by fate. When I arrived in the city, I went straight to the recycling center, a place I had stumbled across in my previous life, filled with study materials left behind by former students. I searched carefully and soon found a familiar set of textbooks. These books had detailed notes and annotations covering various key knowledge points. These things were Grace's secret weapon to improve her grades in her previous life. What's even more ridiculous is that these notes not only helped Grace, but she also gave them to Anthony, helping her barely get into the same university. Those materials that changed their lives should have belonged to me. This time, I collected all my study materials, put them into my school bag, and rode my bike back to the village, my heart filled with new hope. As I passed Linda's market stall, I caught a glimpse of Grace and Anthony sitting on a nearby bench. They sat close together, arm in arm, looking intimate, and clearly no longer trying to hide their relationship. Anthony's eyes were red, and he said angrily, Grace, what should I do now? Everyone is laughing at me. I am too embarrassed to see anyone. Grace patted his shoulder and said soothingly, Don't cry, Anthony. He won't be so proud for long. Anthony asked, But why should he apologize? You have already broken off the engagement. Grace sneered, her tone full of contempt. You think too much, Anthony. He is just being clever and using these tricks to threaten me. He thinks I will be afraid of him? What a joke. Wait a few more days. I bet he will come back to apologize in less than 2 minutes. He paused and smiled smugly. When the time comes, I will make him kneel down and beg for my forgiveness, and even make him compensate me again. Anthony kissed Grace's cheek gently and said with a smile, "Grace, you are the best." However, their sweet moment was interrupted by a sudden outburst of anger. "Well, Grace, so you are here hanging out with your mistress." Linda's voice suddenly sounded, full of anger and dissatisfaction. She dropped her luggage, strode over, grabbed Anthony's hair and pulled it hard. "You shameless man! I've known for a long time that you are not a good person." The scene instantly fell into chaos. Anthony screamed and tried to break free from Linda's hand, while Grace rushed forward and pulled the angry aunt away from Anthony. Anthony ran away angrily. Grace yelled at Linda, "Are you crazy? Auntie, what are you doing?" Linda snorted coldly, pointing at the luggage on the ground, her tone full of grievance and anger. "What else can it be? Your so-called fiancée kicked us out of her house. Now we don't even have a place to live. We can only go back to that shabby little house." Taylor kicked a stone hard, his face full of anger. "I don't want to go back. That place is leaking. It's impossible to live there." Grace frowned and her face darkened. Grace gritted her teeth and said, "Michael is looking for trouble. She just wants to take revenge on me by bullying my family. Michael has completely lost control." Grace gritted her teeth and said, her face gloomy, "He quarreled with me, but took it out on my family. A man is like a child. How can he be so immature?" Grace grabbed Linda's arm, her tone full of anger and unwillingness. "Don't worry, Aunt. We will go to him to settle the score. I want him to know that he has offended the wrong person." When Linda heard this, her mood immediately brightened up. She smiled with relief. "Oh, it turned out to be just a fight. I thought the engagement was really over." She picked up the backpack on the ground and complained, "It's so tiring. It's all your fault. You insisted on getting involved with that shameless man. Now we have no home." Even though she was complaining, she couldn't help but smile smugly and patted Grace on the shoulder, as if she was expecting Michael to bow his head. Just then, I was riding my bicycle leisurely from a distance. Grace was the first to notice me. Her angry face immediately turned into a smug smile. "It seems that we don't even need to look for him. He has come to our door." Linda also showed a satisfied smile, turned her head and said, "Very good. Now let him move all these things back home. Let him know how stupid it is to kick us out." She turned to Grace and said, her tone became stern, "Take these things back. He is the culprit who got us kicked out." I rode by without even glancing at them. Linda and Grace stared at me expectantly, as if they thought I would stop to explain to them, or even apologize. But I just ignored them and walked right past them. They stood there, stunned. Linda's face gradually became gloomy. She glared at Grace and said sharply, "This is all your fault. If you hadn't insisted on getting together with that shameless man, we wouldn't have ended up like this." Grace gritted her teeth, her face becoming increasingly ugly. She suppressed her anger and said coldly, "He did this on purpose to humiliate us. Don't worry, Auntie. Wait. Give him a day. I bet he will crawl back and beg for my forgiveness. He can't leave me." Linda snorted coldly and cursed under her breath, but said nothing more. The next morning, I woke up to a feeling of warmth and comfort that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was the first time I had the whole house to myself, no longer sharing a roof with a family of vampires. No need to get up early to set up a stall. No need to haggle with people over a few cents. For the first time, I truly felt the meaning of a rest day. I got up leisurely and prepared a hearty breakfast for myself. In the past, I would not dare to think of such a luxurious waste, because all my energy and money were used to support Grace's family. I slowly enjoyed every bite of breakfast and couldn't help but smile. This simple happiness was something I never dared to ask for in my previous life. After breakfast, I didn't stop. I took out the study materials I found from the recycling center and focused on reviewing and studying. The material was full of highlights and annotations, which made my learning progress very fast. My brain was like a sponge, absorbing the knowledge quickly, all of which made me feel more satisfied and fulfilled than ever before. During the afternoon break, I took out a pen and paper and began to calculate how much money Grace's family owed me. From the initial scattered expenses, to the daily living expenses, to helping them through the financial difficulties, I recalled and wrote down one by one. I made sure that every account was clearly recorded, and there was no dispute about the calculation results. When I approached Grace's house, I heard Linda's sharp voice from inside the house. "Shouldn't you be setting up a stall? Why are you still staying at home? Get out. The whole family relies on that little income to survive." Then, I heard Grace retort impatiently, "Forget the stall. Just wait for Michael to come back, and everything will be solved. She is never mad at me. And it's only been a day or so. Taylor's voice followed, full of confidence. That's right, Aunt. Just wait a little longer. Michael will be back soon. I was just about to raise my hand to knock on the door when a familiar and shrill voice suddenly came from behind me. Michael, what a surprise. I didn't expect to see you here. Anthony stood not far away with a sarcastic smile, covering his mouth, as if trying to suppress his laughter. What are you doing here? I hope I didn't disturb your plan. I couldn't help but roll my eyes and ignored her. Just then, the door opened. Grace was standing at the door. When she saw me, her face lit up instantly, and she looked very proud. She turned to look at Linda, as if to show off. I told you she would come back. Linda also smiled brightly and said with a smile, I knew that a couple would never hold a grudge overnight. I looked at them coldly, but didn't rush to speak. Just as I was about to speak, Grace raised her hand, posing as a leader, and interrupted me. His face turned serious and he said, Michael, I can forgive you, but you have to agree to a few conditions first. She held up a finger and issued a command. First, apologize to Anthony for tarnishing his reputation. Second, kneel down in front of my aunt and my brother and apologize for making them sleep in that horrible house last night. Third, drop out of school. Focus on managing the stall, earning money to support my family and me full-time. She smiled smugly. As long as you do these, I can let you continue to be my fiancée. Her confident expression almost made me laugh out loud. I took a deep breath, held it back, and asked in a puzzled tone, Grace, are you crazy? As soon as I finished speaking, Anthony immediately said in a pretentious tone, Michael, you should be more polite. After all, you are here to apologize. Now the wisest choice is to be humble and let Grace make the decision. Listening to the two of them performing, I simply can't describe in words how ridiculous they are. I didn't waste any more time. I took out a ledger from my bag and put it on the table with a thump that echoed throughout the room. I said coldly, listen, I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to collect the money you owe me. Grace's smile froze on her face. She frowned and stared at the account book. This is a record of every penny you've borrowed from me over the years. I opened the account book, pointed to the numbers on it, and said word by word, the total is $8,000. I don't need more or less. If you pay off this money, we'll be even. From now on, you go your way, I go mine, and we won't interfere with each other. Anthony's face suddenly turned ugly. She glanced at Grace nervously, and Grace's face turned pale because of anger. Her hands were clenched into fists, and the blue veins were faintly visible. Michael, Anthony suddenly shrieked. Grace has done so much for you, and you are still so cruel to him? His expression seemed to be accusing me, as if I was the vicious person. I sneered and looked at Anthony with a cold tone. She did so much for me? Anthony, are you sure it's not me who did so much for her? Anthony felt uncomfortable with my gaze. But Grace has always loved you so much. I interrupted him with a sneer. Love me? A man who relies on me to make money to support himself and his family and tries to control me with threats? Anthony, don't fool yourself. She loves neither me nor you. She loves herself and those who can be used. My words left Anthony speechless, with a flash of panic in his eyes. Grace was so angry that she almost exploded, but I didn't give him a chance to speak. Grace, I said calmly, but with unquestionable strength, you'd better know this debt. If you don't pay it off, I don't mind letting the whole village know how much you owe me and how your family eats and drinks for me for free. Grace's fists clenched and unclenched. Her face turned livid. Her pride and anger seemed to be wrestling with each other, but I no longer cared about her reaction. You only have one choice. I stared at her. My tone as cold as a knife. Pay back the money and get out of my life. Anthony coldly, with a tone of disdain and sarcasm. Anthony, since you love Grace so much, and you have spent a lot of money on me before, you should definitely help him pay it back, right? After all, aren't you true love? Anthony's expression froze instantly, and he could only lower his head in silence. Linda forced a forced smile on her face, trying to ease the atmosphere. Michael, we have known each other for so many years, there is no need to make such a big deal, right? I looked at her coldly, ignoring her attempts at reconciliation, and continued, Linda, I know what your family is up to. Do you think you can avoid paying back the money? Who knows what dirty tricks you will use? So today, I have called the villagers over to let everyone see and witness it. As soon as I finished speaking, there was a commotion outside the yard, and the villagers gathered around one by one. They looked at Grace's family. Their expressions changed from confusion to contempt, and the atmosphere instantly became tense. What's going on? Someone asked. I heard that Grace's family owed Michael money and they wanted to default on it. Didn't their daughter betray Michael? Another villager added. This time they are just seeking justice. This family has never had any sense of shame, someone sneered. I remember the old man did the same thing back then and ended up getting drunk and causing trouble and was beaten up and hospitalized. Pay back the money quickly, a villager advised. We all live in the same village. Don't embarrass yourself. Listening to the villagers' comments, Linda was furious, but she didn't dare to vent her anger on Grace. Instead, she suddenly grabbed Anthony's arm and started beating him. It's all your fault. You man. You ruined our family. Anthony screamed and tried to break free, but Linda was merciless and grabbed his hair and pulled it. Taylor hid aside, cursing quietly while sneaking into the house. Grace finally realized that I was not here to apologize, but to settle accounts. Her face was grim and her eyes were wandering, but under the gaze of the villagers, she could no longer play tricks and could only reluctantly go into the house to look for her savings. When she found that she couldn't get the money together, she gritted her teeth and forced Linda and Anthony to hand over the only cash they had. Finally, she handed me a wad of crumpled bills and said in a cold voice, Michael, this is what you want. I'll pay you back, but don't expect me to marry you. I took the money calmly, counted it, then raised my head and said coldly, it's not enough. You still need more than half. For people spent so much time and only collected this little money? My words made the villagers who were watching couldn't help but burst into laughter. Grace's face turned red instantly, and her eyes were full of shame and anger. Give me a few more days, she said, gritting her teeth. Then write an IOU. I replied calmly. Grace had no choice but to write the IOU. Her hands were shaking slightly with anger. As she handed me the IOU, she growled, Michael, you will regret this. Mark my words. I ignored her threats and left with the IOU. Before leaving, I said coldly, pay back the remaining money within 2 months. Otherwise, don't blame me for looking for villagers to witness it. Grace stood there, her face livid with anger, but she could do nothing. The villagers were still gathered in the yard, whispering. At that moment, I knew that the reputation of this family had been completely ruined. For the next 2 months, I was finally able to focus on my own life without being dragged down by them. During this time, I also met a woman named Ms. Gua, who was a famous handmade shoemaker in the village. But Ms. Gua is not an ordinary shoemaker. She rose step by step from the village in her previous life and eventually became a legendary figure who became the queen of handmade shoes. Not only does she have her own chain brand, she is also quite influential in the business world. I used part of my savings to invest in her business and became her partner. At the same time, I also helped with sales in her store, using the experience and skills I accumulated in my previous life to win more customers and reputation for her. Ms. Gua is a kind and wise person. After she learned that I lost my parents and lived alone, she took extra care of me. I also respected and appreciated her from the bottom of my heart and regarded her as my own family member. Although I spent most of my time studying and helping Ms. Gua, occasionally, I would hear some news about Grace and her family. Since that day, their family's reputation in the village was completely ruined. Every day, villagers threw rotten vegetables and fruits at their house, and whenever they went out, they became the target of rumors. Linda's market stall was vandalized, her goods stolen or destroyed, and she was unable to continue operating. And Anthony? She lost all her pretense and faced the villagers' accusations, and she spent her days in tears. Linda's business was completely ruined, and she had no more income. When she was upset, she would take it out on Anthony and demand that she pay back the debt her family owed me. Grace? She was too focused on her own troubles to bother defending Anthony. She even turned a blind eye to it. To her, Anthony was a ready-made scapegoat, a tool who could share her responsibility. In order to please Grace and win back her love, Anthony even stole the few remaining money in his family. When his parents found out, they were furious and severely punished him, even kicking him out of the house. With nowhere to go, Anthony had to move to Grace's house and live a poor and chaotic life with them. Finally, Grace struggled to collect the money she owed me and wrote the final IOU. Her face was twisted with anger, and she roared, Michael, you will regret this. Mark my words. I just smiled coldly and ignored her threats. After getting the money, I completely severed my relationship with Grace. As for what happened to her family later, that was no longer something I cared about. Meanwhile, my life was thriving. Ms. Gua's business grew bigger and bigger, and she opened several new branches in town and city. As her partner, I received generous dividends every month. This money made me very fulfilled, especially since she insisted that I focus on studying and not worry about the business, but my share of the profits never decreased. She also encouraged me to spend money on myself, to treat myself well, to dress myself well, and to continue my studies to improve my life. This reminded me of Linda, who had tried every means to force me to drop out of school to earn money to support my family, and she kept asking me for money. Ms. Gua's kindness and sincerity moved me to tears. Following her advice, I went to the city to buy myself some new clothes and began to try foods that I had never dared to try before. My life began to become more fulfilling and happier. Soon after, I made a new friend who became my closest confidant. Her parents were both teachers and often provided free tutoring sessions to help me improve my grades further. Time passed quickly, and the college entrance examination came as scheduled. With sufficient preparation and hard work, I did very well in the exam, and my friend also performed well, and both of us have a good chance of being admitted to the prestigious universities of our choice. As for Grace and Anthony, they don't have the study materials I provided or the money I worked so hard to earn to support them. This time, their lives were completely different from their previous lives. The days were filled with hunger and struggle, and lacking the necessary resources, they could not concentrate on their studies at all, and eventually they even failed to take the college entrance examination. When the test results were announced, I got what I wanted and was successfully admitted to the university of my dreams. The news spread quickly throughout the village, and many people came to congratulate me. Even Grace's family, dressed in tattered clothes and looking dusty, appeared in the crowd. Linda, Grace, and Taylor looked as thin as beggars, and they had lost their former arrogance. When they approached, I frowned. "What are you doing here?" Grace lowered her head, her face full of pleading. The proud look he once had was long gone. His voice was low and humble. "Michael, I know I was wrong. Can we start over? I am willing to make up for everything." Linda quickly agreed, smiling. "Yes, Michael, come back and be with Grace. I support you going to college." Her flattering tone made me feel sick. I looked at them coldly, not hiding my contempt. "I got into college through my own efforts. Why do I need your permission? Who do you think you are?" Grace clenched her fists and forced a smile on her face. "Michael, I will work hard to support you. College tuition is expensive, and your life will be difficult without help." Just then, a firm voice sounded from behind. "Who said he would struggle financially?" I turned around and saw Ms. Guo walking towards me. She was wearing a sophisticated suit and exuded confidence and authority. Today was the opening day of her new store, and she had come all the way to congratulate me. She smiled and handed me a big gift box. "Michael, congratulations on realizing your dream." Grace and her family stared at Ms. Guo blankly, and it took them several seconds to realize who she was. Recently, the village has been talking about Ms. Guo, the handmade shoe queen, who rose from a small village and is now a well-known figure in the business world. Linda was so shocked that she whispered, "Oh my God, this is impossible." Grace could no longer control her emotions. She pointed at me and yelled, "You cunning woman! How did you get close to him?" Ms. Guo glanced at him coldly. "You are not welcome." Before Grace could refute, several tall bodyguards of Ms. Guo came forward and stared coldly at Grace and her family. In the end, they were forced to leave in disgrace. However, the story does not end there. That night, my house suddenly caught fire, with thick smoke and flames rising to the sky. Through the firelight, I saw Grace and Anthony standing in the distance, holding torches in their hands. Their faces were full of hatred and madness. "Let's see what you are so proud of." Grace laughed crazily. "Do you think you are better than us? I will burn your house and destroy everything you have, and then we will see how you can go to college." Just as they turned around and tried to run away, a group of police officers rushed out and stopped them. The leading police officer said coldly, "Grace, Anthony, you are arrested for arson." Grace's face turned pale, and she stammered in fear. "Impossible! How did you know?" I walked out from behind the crowd and answered with a faint smile. "Because I knew your plan in advance, I deliberately left all the evidence and called the village chief, villagers, and the police." Anthony's face turned pale, and he pointed at me tremblingly. "It's you? It's you who framed us." "Yes, it's me," I replied with a smile. "You should pay the price for your actions." Grace completely lost control and cursed, "Vicious man." But she was eventually handcuffed by the police and taken away with Anthony. The fire was quickly put out, and my home was not seriously damaged except for a few burnt walls. Their revenge was the beginning of their own destruction. Grace and Anthony were eventually found liable for the damages I had incurred as a result of the fire. But the debt was so large that they could not possibly pay it back. This was the final straw. The court sentenced them to a term of imprisonment and sent them to a dilapidated prison outside the city. There, They not only had to endure boring labor, but were also ruthlessly bullied by other prisoners. Just a few months later, I heard the news that both Grace and Anthony had died in detention. This seems to be the final judgment of fate. Linda was unwilling to give up, so she came to the door of my old house, crying and calling me a messenger of disaster, saying that I had killed her son and demanded that I compensate her for her son's pain. She stood guard at the door from morning till night, even ignoring the ridicule of passers-by. But she didn't know that I was no longer there. That morning, I boarded a train to the big city with my best friend and Ms. Gua. I had sold my house to someone else and bid farewell to this village and those painful memories. The train slowly moved away. The morning sun shone all over the land. I looked out the window at the scenery that was rapidly receding, and my heart was filled with unprecedented hope and expectation. If you like this story, please like it and subscribe. Feel free to leave your thoughts and suggestions in the comments. See you in the next story.